Welcome back to more Turning Pages. Today we are talking with Tasneem Jamal. She is the author of the novel Where the Air is Sweet. Welcome to Turning Pages,
Thank
Tasneem.
you.
So can you tell me a bit about your motivation for writing Where the Air is Sweet?
My primary motivation was to bear witness, to tell the story of the Asian expulsion from Uganda. This was a personal experience of mine and my family's, and I was aware growing up and then even as an adult, and when I started to research, just cursory research about Uganda, that there wasn't really much in the history books about the experience of Asians living in East Africa on the whole, and the expulsion specifically, and certainly in terms of art. A novel or a film or that type of thing, it just didn't exist, and so I felt compelled to tell the story.
And I know that just from reading your website and talking with you earlier that writing it here in Canada, there seemed to be kind of a barrier to getting the creative process going.
Yeah, and I don't know that I was aware that it was that there was a barrier. I was struggling for quite some years to tell the story in what I felt was an authentic voice. I had at one point I had about 60,000 words written of a manuscript, and it just wasn't ringing true.
Right.
And at that point, I kind of stopped writing, not so much because I had a problem with the manuscript, but because I was in a relationship and I became pregnant, and that became my focus. And then once my daughter was about a year old, my husband and I were talking about our respective dreams, and so this novel again came to the fore, and I had an opportunity to go to East Africa and live there, which is something I hadn't even really acknowledged to myself that I wanted to do that.
Right.
Because I was so young when we left, I felt really robbed. Like I didn't have memories. I didn't. I felt very cut off from that experience, and so I harbored this unspoken desire to go live there. And so at that point, I don't even know that I necessarily was thinking I had to go there to write it.
Right.
I just wanted a connection to the place, and so. My husband was going to fly airplanes, and I thought, okay, and I'll write my book, since this was a trip of dreams. And so so that was how it came to be that we moved to Tanzania, and I quite consciously set aside time every day to start working on the book. But I think it was more feeling disoriented, feeling living in this kind of chaos, which Dar es Salaam was to my mind, and also committing to writing the book fully, and having lived a little bit in the past. You know, I had a very secure, compact little life, but I hadn't been living very boldly, I don't think. And you know, now I had a baby, and I'd gotten married, and 2 babies by the time we left, and sort of threw all fear aside and decided to do this, and that was what seemed to free it. And so that when it came, there was a music to the writing that had just not been there before.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How old were you when your family left?
When I was, the expulsion was in 1972, so I was 3.5 then.
Oh, right.
But my family lived in Kenya for a time.
Okay.
So I was 6 when we settled in Canada, but I was obviously very young, and those formative years were quite unsettled.
Right.
And so that added to my sense that I felt something was missing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it must have really affected your parents.
Leaving. Yes, absolutely. The whole community. I mean, it was actually ultimately an advantage that my entire family, all cousins, everybody, left en masse.
Right.
And some of my family went to the UK, but a lot came to Canada. And so even though we were all uprooted and it was very difficult, everybody was together, and that support system was everything.
It would be, yes.
It really was. It was what allowed everyone to thrive quite quickly.
And I know from reading your book that Canada's portrayed quite beautifully, and even the border, the customs gentleman at the end.
Yes.
Was that the experience?
Yes.
It seemed very welcoming?
Absolutely. Okay. It was. It's very much. I mean, I don't know that I set out to write a feel-good Canada story, but it is. It's a feel-good story about Canada, and the whole response of the Canadian government and the diplomatic efforts, and then the personal experiences that people had with Canadian officials was positive.
Oh, good.
Just about everyone I spoke to had a positive experience, and I've also had this great experience of meeting the diplomats, the immigration officials who had
Right.
worked in Kampala
Oh,
at that
okay.
time. I've been able to meet them and hear, their side of the narrative, and
Right.
it's been fantastic. And they also had a really uplifting experience because it all ended well,
Right.
and was handled remarkably smoothly. So yeah, it was
that's good.
It was all very positive.
Yeah.
For sure.
And certainly when somebody writes a book that is somewhat based on something that happened in their life, I think there's always the question of, well, how much is autobiography?
It's a fair question. Yeah, sure.
So was much of it? I mean, you were so young.
Yes,
How could it be?
so it wasn't. There's probably one or two scenes that I would call autobiographical
Right.
in that I experienced them. But the overall arc of the story is the experience of my family, that my grandfather left India in the early 1920s,
Oh, okay.
settled in Uganda, and our leaving was very similar to the
Oh, okay.
family in the book, in that my father stayed behind, like the character does
Right.
in the book, and then we ended up in Kitchener. So
okay.
the arc
Yes.
was very much my family's experience, but the individual relationships, the sort of detailed events that happened, those were fictionalized, and that's where I was able to be more creative in my storytelling. So it's a bit of a, it's not a clear line.
Right.
It never really is, I don't
No,
think.
that's right.
And ultimately it's my story of what happened anyway. Like, the Raju, the primary narrator in the story, I really patterned him as much as I knew my grandfather.
Right.
But again, it's my story of my grandfather, and,
Right.
and a cousin would have a very different take on him. So, he died when I was 7, so I had to imagine him as a young man, and I enjoyed that process. Actually, I felt a connection, which was quite lovely
good.
and unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And has the response from the rest of your family been positive?
It has.
Okay.
Yeah. My parents in particular really enjoyed it and were touched by it. And I've received emails from Ugandan Asians, former Ugandan Asians, who it clearly meant so much. And this was my intention: was it validated their experience, their life, something that they hadn't realized as they were doing it, which I think is quite human. You don't realize it's extraordinary what
Right.
you're doing, right? You're
Right.
just living your life.
Right. Yeah, that's
and then,
true.
And then to have it, have somebody bear witness and show that it wasn't, that it was extraordinary,
Yes.
and that the way it was handled was extraordinary. And ultimately it's their story, so that when they would write to me and say things like, "Wow, I felt like I went back," and I thought, "How nice," because I wasn't there, and yet I
Right.
was able to bring that out for them. So that
That's
it was
good.
Yeah.
It is very beautifully written. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Are you working on anything now?
I am. I had been working on a novel. I was being pulled a little bit in two directions, and as I was working on this, I published this essay recently in Chatelaine about my husband and I taking off to East Africa, and from that, my agent felt maybe there's a nonfiction book in this story.
Right.
And when he said it initially, I hadn't really considered nonfiction. But creative nonfiction is still. Still telling a good story, and because it seems sort of perfect, because I had been struggling with a story, and
Right.
then here it came, and so I've been feeling a lot of energy to do that. So that's what I'm working on.
Oh,
now.
good.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, I
Yeah.
can't wait to read it.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much, Tasneem,
pleasure.
for taking time to chat with us.
my pleasure.
And we'll be back with more Turning Pages.